to China, where the Gobi Desert grows by about 3,000 kilometers each year.
The sand dust comes mainly from land which has been destroyed in 4 ways.
In 1988, a stretch of the Kubuqi Desert in Inner Mongolia was a sea of shifting sand, lifeless under a scorching sun and relentless winds. When Chinese workers began burying straw in precise grids and planting hardy shrubs across the barren dunes, the world scoffed. Environmentalists called it a futile gesture, scientists dismissed it as a waste of resources, and international media mocked what they labelled political theatre in the sand. How could anyone hope to grow forests where rainfall barely reached 100 millimeters a year? Yet, behind the ridicule, China was quietly experimenting with a method that combined ingenuity, persistence, and science. Everybody laughed at China for burying tons of plants in the desert, and now, 10 years later, they regretted it. This is one story you can't miss. Let's get started. Origins of the project. By the mid-20th century, northern China was facing an environmental crisis on a scale unmatched in its modern history. Decades of deforestation, overgrazing, and poorly managed agriculture had stripped the soil. Grasslands that once supported vast herds of sheep, goats, and camels were thinning into brittle expanses of dust. Forests had been cleared to meet the rising demand for farmland and timber during the Great Leap Forward and subsequent industrial expansion. As tractors churned up fragile soils and windstorms swept unchecked across the plains, desertification accelerated. The winds carried sand from the Gobi and Tenga deserts deep into agricultural heartlands, burying fields and choking rivers. Entire villages were engulfed by drifting dunes. By the 1960s and 1970s, dust storms became an annual catastrophe, reducing visibility in Beijing to a few meters and coating northern cities in layers of yellow sand. Scientists from the Chinese Academy of Sciences began issuing warnings as early as 1958, identifying overgrazing and fuel wood collection as primary causes of soil degradation. The disaster seemed unstoppable. Well, that was until it was stopped. But that was decades later. Back then, satellite observations and ground surveys conducted in the following decades confirmed the scale of the damage. Desertified land was spreading southward by thousands of square kilometers each year. By 1977, China reported to the newly formed United Nations Conference on Desertification that roughly 27% of its land, an estimated 2.6 million square kilometers, had become degraded to the point of classification as desert or near desert. The human impact was staggering. More than 400 million people in northern provinces, such as Inner Mongolia, Ningxia, Gansu, Shaanxi, and Hebei, were living on or near desertified land. Agricultural output declined, water tables dropped, and rural poverty deepened. In the 1970s, the government began to treat desertification as a national security concern. The State Council commissioned research teams to evaluate the expanding sand hazard, which was increasingly seen as a threat to both food security and economic stability. The data collected between 1975 and 1977 were alarming enough to prompt direct intervention. When the Third National Forestry Conference convened in 1978, the leadership under Deng Xiaoping approved an unprecedented ecological project, the Three North Shelter Forest Program, or Sanbei Fanghulin Gongcheng. Its purpose was clear but audacious: to build a massive, multi-tiered belt of trees and vegetation across the arid northern arc of the country, stretching from the northeastern province of Heilongjiang through the steppes of Inner Mongolia and into the deserts of Gansu and Xinjiang in the northwest. This belt would function as a biological wall, an immense green barrier designed to shield farmland, settlements, and infrastructure from wind erosion and encroaching sand. The project's nickname, the Great Green Wall of China, deliberately echoed the ancient fortifications built to protect China's borders. In the reform era, Beijing sought to demonstrate that modernization could coexist with ecological stewardship. The desertification crisis had become a visible reminder of the country's environmental neglect during the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. The new leadership viewed ecological rehabilitation as a symbol of national renewal, a way to restore productivity to rural areas while preventing mass migration from degraded lands. The long-term vision of the 3 North Shelter Forest Program endured through successive political administrations, continuously adjusted based on ecological monitoring and scientific feedback. Its planners understood that progress would not be measured in years or even decades, but across generations. But how did they do it? The burying plants technique. Ecologists working under the Chinese Academy of Sciences began experimenting with methods to halt the advance of dunes that devoured farmland and villages. One of the most unconventional of these techniques became known as the straw checkerboard system. Developed by desert researchers at the Shapatu Desert Research and Experiment Station in Ningxia, the method relied on agricultural waste, bundles of straw arranged in geometric precision. Teams of workers dug shallow pits in the sand and laid straw in grid formations measuring roughly 1 by 1 meter, or sometimes 1.2 by 1.2 meters, 1.2 meters, creating a repeating pattern of squares that blanketed the dunes like woven fabric. Each bundle was half buried, anchored firmly against the wind. This pattern served a critical aerodynamic purpose. The checkerboards disrupted airflow near the ground, cutting wind velocity at the surface by as much as 60%. With the wind's erosive force reduced, sand grains could settle instead of drifting freely. The grid also acted as a net, trapping organic matter and moisture carried by passing winds or rare rainfall events. Over time, this artificial surface created small pockets of stability within an otherwise fluid landscape. In these protected cells, the conditions became suitable for life to take root. Chinese botanists began planting hardy, deep-rooted shrubs and xerophytes that could survive with annual precipitation below 100 millimeters. These plants were not chosen for aesthetics, but for function. Their roots knitted through the sand, binding the dunes together. The concept was simple, inexpensive, and scalable, but its appearance led to ridicule abroad. Western scientific reports during the 1980s and 1990s often referred to it dismissively as burying straw in sand. To critics, it looked like a desperate and futile gesture against nature's vastness. Many observers cited the low survival rates of early plantings as evidence that the approach was unsustainable. In the first decades of use, especially during the 1960s and 1970s, failures were common. Straw decayed rapidly in high winds and summer heat, and the transplanted shrubs often died before their roots could reach deeper moisture. Poor seed selection, inadequate irrigation, and a lack of maintenance programs led to patchy results. In regions such as the Alxa Plateau of Inner Mongolia, survival rates for saplings fell below 20%. The skepticism was not unfounded, but the Chinese researchers persisted, adjusting and testing continuously. Their persistence would eventually find its greatest expression in the Kubuqi Desert, one of the 7 major deserts of China and once nicknamed the Sea of Death. Spanning roughly 18,600 square kilometers within the Ordos Plateau of Inner Mongolia, the Kubuqi had been a source of recurring dust storms that blanketed northern China for decades. In 1988, the private company Elion Resources Group, working with the local government and herding communities, began a restoration project that combined the traditional straw checkerboard method with modern technologies. The team installed straw grids to stabilize dunes and then introduced drip irrigation systems powered by solar energy to support newly planted vegetation. Economic incentives were built into the program from the start. Residents were encouraged to cultivate Chinese licorice, a drought-tolerant medicinal plant with significant market value. Over the next 3 decades, This model of ecological engineering, paired with local enterprise, transformed the region. By 2018, satellite data and field measurements confirmed that more than 6,000 square kilometers of desert had been stabilized. Vegetation cover, once below 3%, exceeded 53%. The once barren dunes now supported mosaics of shrubs, grasses, and commercial crops, while solar energy projects added new revenue streams. The transformation lifted over 100,000 local residents out of poverty and drew international attention as one of the most successful desert reclamation efforts on record. Similar approaches spread westward to other arid regions. In the Tengger Desert, straddling Ningxia and Gansu provinces, the government supported a series of restoration projects during the 2000s and 20s. Here, straw checkerboards were laid across dune fields in combination with drought-resistant vegetation. Using drip irrigation systems and improved planting protocols, more than 32,351 hectares of land were rehabilitated by 2021, according to World Bank project assessments. These interventions not only stabilized sand, but also reduced the frequency of dust storms affecting nearby agricultural communities. To the east, in the Mu'us Desert, a region overlapping Inner Mongolia and Shaanxi, satellite imagery captured dramatic ecological recovery between 2000 and 2017. Once one of China's fastest expanding deserts, the Mu'us had lost more than one-third of its area to active sand dunes by the late 20th century. Yet, as reforestation and grassland restoration expanded, driven by the combined use of straw grids and vegetative planting, the desert's advance slowed and even reversed in some areas. NASA's moderate-resolution imaging spectroradiometer data later confirmed the greening trend, showing consistent increases in vegetative cover across northern China during that period. These local successes depended on a foundation of careful engineering. The straw checkerboards acted as the first line of defense against erosion, but they were soon integrated with additional structures. Sand-fixing fences, windbreaks of willow or poplar, and grass barriers reinforced the grid's stability. In particularly exposed zones, workers arranged multi-layered systems combining mechanical barriers and biological cover. Irrigation, once a limiting factor, was revolutionized by solar-powered pumps and precision drip systems that conserved water while maintaining soil moisture in root zones. This technological synergy marked a turning point, transforming a once rudimentary practice into a coordinated form of desert ecosystem management. Equally critical was the refinement of plant selection. Scientists began to favor native, slow-growing shrubs and perennial grasses over water-intensive trees. Hardy plant species were chosen for their ability to tolerate saline soils and extreme temperature fluctuations, often exceeding 40 degrees Celsius in summer and dropping below -20 degrees Celsius in winter. The focus shifted from creating forests to building resilient ecosystems. By the 2010s, biological research stations across Ningxia, Inner Mongolia, and Gansu had compiled extensive data on plant physiology and soil chemistry, guiding region-specific restoration plans. As the projects matured, remote sensing technologies provided quantitative evidence of progress. Between 2000 and 2017, analyses of NASA's MODIS satellite data and research from Boston University revealed that China accounted for roughly 25% of the planet's total increase in green vegetation. From criticism and global skepticism to major success. When China began its vast desert rehabilitation programs in the late 20th century, the global scientific community met the effort with skepticism bordering on disbelief. Experts argued that attempting to grow large-scale forests in arid and semi-arid regions was ecologically unsound. Their concerns were rooted in well-established hydrological principles. In areas where annual precipitation measured less than 100 millimeters, Trees required more water than the ecosystem could sustainably supply. Research from Western hydrologists, particularly those associated with the World Resources Institute and the International Union for Conservation of Nature, cautioned that afforestation could accelerate groundwater depletion, further drying out fragile soils. These scientists warned that planting the desert green might do more harm than good if the species used were non-native, shallow-rooted, or poorly adapted to local hydrological cycles. The early results seemed to validate those doubts. During the first decades of China's afforestation campaigns, mortality rates among planted trees were staggeringly high. In regions like the Alxa Plateau of Inner Mongolia and the eastern margins of the Gobi, survival rates sometimes fell below 30%, meaning that over 70% of saplings died within a few years of planting. Many tree species, particularly fast-growing varieties such as poplars, were chosen for their rapid visual impact rather than long-term ecological suitability. They grew quickly when supported by irrigation, but withered once the water was withdrawn. Reports from the 1990s and early 2000s described vast stands of withered trunks stretching across the horizon. Environmental NGOs and international media outlets seized on such imagery, branding China's programs as political greening, designed more to impress through satellite photographs than to restore functioning ecosystems. Articles in publications such as The Guardian and Scientific American during this period questioned whether the government's Great Green Wall was a sustainable environmental project or a symbolic act of national pride. Analysts pointed to monoculture plantations, or single-species belts of trees, that were vulnerable to pests, diseases, and drought. Others criticized the straw checkerboard method and related stabilization techniques as theatrical, suggesting that burying straw in sand or planting saplings in desiccated soil could never counter the sheer scale of desert systems like the Gobi, which covers over 1.2 million square kilometers. Even within China, ecologists debated whether the state's top-down, production-oriented approach could adapt to regional variation and long-term ecological feedback. By the early 2000s, however, the narrative began to shift. Improvements in satellite observation, combined with on-the-ground monitoring, provided hard data that contradicted many earlier assumptions. Remote sensing by the Chinese Academy of Forestry and NASA's moderate-resolution imaging. Spectroradiometer began revealing subtle but consistent increases in vegetative cover across northern China. Areas that had been written off as hopelessly barren were showing measurable greening trends. In 2013, the Chinese government released comprehensive desertification surveys, indicating that the total area of active deserts had begun to decline. This was a reversal of the expansion trends recorded for more than half a century. Independent analysis later supported those findings. Between 2000 and 2018, China's deserts were shrinking by an estimated 2,000 square kilometers each year. The transformation was most visible in regions like the Kubuqi Desert in Inner Mongolia. Once synonymous with desolation, the Kubuqi became a flagship example of sustainable desert restoration through a combination of ecological engineering, local enterprise, and state support. By 2017, the United Nations Environment Programme formally recognized the Kubuqi model as one of the world's best examples of land restoration. Satellite images confirmed that more than 6,000 square kilometers of land previously dominated by shifting dunes had been stabilized. Vegetation coverage in some zones had increased from less than 3% to more than 50%, and soil organic matter levels had risen by measurable margins. The impact of these successes rippled beyond China's borders. International organizations that had once dismissed the effort began to study its outcomes. The World Bank, in a 2021 report on land degradation and restoration in China's Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region, confirmed significant improvements in soil stability, vegetation density, and reductions in dust storm frequency in treated zones. The report cited 32,351 hectares of rehabilitated land where sand dunes had been converted into semi-fixed terrain capable of supporting grass and shrubs. Similar improvements were recorded in the Tengger and Mu'us deserts, where consistent use of straw grids, native shrubs, and solar-powered drip irrigation reshaped landscapes once dominated by moving sand. From an international perspective, the most convincing evidence came from space. A 2019 study by researchers at Boston University, using satellite data from NASA's MODIS instruments, found that China and India together accounted for 1/3 of the planet's total increase in green vegetation since 2000. China alone contributed approximately 25% of this global greening, largely due to its reforestation and agricultural programs. The findings provided a quantitative validation of what had previously been visible only at local scales. Between 1980 and 2023, China's forest coverage expanded from about 12% of national territory to roughly 23%, representing tens of millions of hectares of newly forested or restored land. The decade between 2013 and 2023 is often referred to as the 10-year regret period by Chinese media, referring to the global shift from skepticism to recognition. During those years, satellite imagery revealed striking changes across the Kubuqi and Mu'us deserts. Patches of green vegetation appeared where dunes had once been bare, and ecological corridors began linking isolated oases. Some of these belts were visible even in low-resolution satellite photographs, prompting comparisons to the Great Wall that inspired the original program's nickname. The benefits extended far beyond the visible greening. The frequency and intensity of dust storms reaching major cities such as Beijing, Tianjin, and Hohhot declined markedly after the mid-2000s. According to data from the China Meteorological Administration, the number of days affected by severe dust storms in Beijing fell from more than 26 per year in the 1970s to fewer than 3 per year by the 2010s. The reduction was attributed not only to regional weather patterns, but also to the expanded vegetation coverage in northern deserts that reduced the availability of loose sand. The improvement in air quality and reduced storm damage generated billions of dollars in avoided economic losses. The environmental recovery was closely tied to a social and economic transformation. In Inner Mongolia, local economies that had once depended almost entirely on herding began diversifying. The integration of ecological restoration with renewable energy and agriculture created new sources of income. Solar farms were established on stabilized dunes, combining clean energy production with continued erosion control. Medicinal plant cultivation, particularly of licorice and sand willow, developed into a multi-million-dollar industry. Ecotourism followed, as the green deserts became symbols of China's technological and environmental progress. By the late 2010s, the international tone toward China's desertification projects had changed dramatically. Publications that had once mocked the idea of burying straw in sand began acknowledging the measurable results. The Kubuqi model was presented at United Nations desertification conferences as a case study in scalable land restoration. UNEP and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification began citing China's methods as potential templates for regions facing similar challenges, including the Sahel's Great Green Wall Initiative in Africa. While debates continued over sustainability and water management, the data were undeniable. The combination of straw checkerboards, drought-resistant vegetation, and economic integration had achieved a measurable reversal of desertification trends. The skeptics had not been entirely wrong. Early failures were real, and challenges remain, but by 2025, even the most critical observers have conceded that China had achieved something extraordinary: the large-scale recovery of ecosystems once considered permanently lost. Despite remarkable progress in northern China's desert reclamation, significant challenges remain. In the most arid sectors, particularly in the eastern Gobi and Aoksa plateaus, survival rates for newly planted trees and shrubs linger between 15 and 20%, reflecting the harsh realities of extreme drought, high soil salinity, and temperature fluctuations exceeding 60 degrees Celsius seasonally. Over-extraction of groundwater to support irrigation has created long-term sustainability concerns, as aquifers decline faster than natural recharge rates. Monoculture plantations, common in early phases of the 3 North Shelter Forest Program, remain vulnerable to pests, diseases, and soil nutrient depletion, highlighting the limitations of single-species strategies in fragile ecosystems. Desertification still threatens approximately 2.6 million square kilometers of Chinese land, and climate change is intensifying pressures through more erratic rainfall, stronger dust storms, and rising temperatures. Experts now advocate for a shift toward comprehensive ecosystem restoration that integrates grasslands, drought-tolerant shrubs, soil rehabilitation, and improved water management rather than focusing solely on tree planting. China has set a trend. The world is now following and appreciating it. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.